Welcome, everybody. This is the Spring Conference on Creativity, the first of its kind. It will occur every year. It is sponsored by the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity, which is the umbrella group that's over the societies for the philosophy of creativity, and there are three of those, one for the Pacific Division, one for the Eastern Division, and we've disaffiliated with the Central Division and moved ourselves here for a number. The Foundation for Philosophy of Creativity has decided to fund a number of meetings and conferences here, including a dissertation fellowship that lasts for 2 months during the summer. And so the mission of the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity is to promote the study of creativity, particularly in a philosophical way. For that purpose, the foundation uses its resources. And so John is now going to tell you about here.
Well, hi, I'm John Shook. I'm the president of our institute here for American philosophical and cultural thought. And the purpose includes research. So it's a research center and archive full of over 20,000 volumes, and various papers are here. We're in the vicinity of Carbondale, Illinois, and of course Southern Illinois University, which has long been a depository for archival papers and books about the history of American thought. Here we can host multiple researchers at the same time, and in fact we have over the past couple of years hosted people from across the United States and around the world, and that is accelerating. And we believe that we serve a vital need for the philosophical community. There are kinds of research that can be done here that it would be difficult to do in many other places around the world. So we're very proud of the work that we do here. Another function is educational, so there are various resources at our website, americanphilosophy.net. Please go visit, and we can also host events like this. So I'm very happy to have everybody here today. Thank you for coming.
And facilitating the first of 4 sessions, and then there's an evening lecture, is Dave Weizsäcker, who will be giving the evening lecture. But he has been resident fellow for the 2018-2019 year, and has been here a lot. And so you're facilitating and.
Well, hello. Welcome to our mini conference on creativity. Our first talk today will be given by Carbondale's own Matt Donnelly, a recent PhD, I believe, from SIU, and now teaching at John Logan College. Take it away.
Thank you, and of course, thank you, John and Randy, and everyone at the Institute for the opportunity. I appreciate this. As a little background, this paper grew out of some of the interests that I worked on in my dissertation, but for those of you who've read portions of my dissertation, there are a couple of you here, it's significantly different from that topic as well. So, with that little background, we'll begin. My paper is titled On the New and on the Novel, Creative Logics in Time. The first section is Creativity in Time. Creativity, and by association, logics of creativity, has 2 senses when temporalized, and by temporalized I mean when creativity is operative in and through time. The first of these senses is the seemingly spontaneous formulation of the temporally sequentially new, and then the ontologically novel. This first sense of creativity is, in different words, radical openness to being as possibility. To borrow a thought from Heidegger, it is abiding in and within being. Now I assert this abiding as an openness, and therefore an openness to past, present, and future as aspects of temporal flux, or what I would call the omnidirectional dunamis of temporality. And this sense of creation, or creativity, is that from possible to actual. This creativity is present in both interpretation as well as, more frequently, expression. And for those of you who can't see the written word, X is italicized in expression. So my emphasis wasn't enough. That's what I mean by it. As it relates to the current topic and the topic of this conference, this first characterization of creativity conditions, but is not itself a ground of, a radically historicist interpretation of previous interpretations of the temporally new, in other words, the numerically distinct, and ontologically novel, the qualitatively distinct and self-assertoric ways of being. The second sense of creativity is what I would call responsiveness to the past as it effects the present. And this sense is also a ground of a living historicist logic. This second sense also describes the new and the novel, but as creation from actual to possible. For both senses, the past, including past interpretations, is effectually present in continuity through time. Both senses then ground the new and ground the novel upon the tensive interplay between actual and possible. As for this second sense of creativity, one should avoid interpretations that confuse the new with the novel. Neither interpretation, of course, is deterministic, and neither necessitates a radical, pernicious auto-destruction of temporal continuities. Given that I take creativity in all of its senses as equiprimordial with both being and with time, an assertion for which I will not argue in this presentation, I reject a simplistic, over-reduced determinism. Therefore, insofar as brute determinism, especially in an iterative description of genealogies of interpretation, is prima facie untenable, there surely exists an effectual creativity, in both senses of creativity, in continuity over time. This creativity allows interpreters to work within a genealogy of knowledge, or a genealogy of meaning, and by that I mean a patina of meaning and an account, in the sense of Plato's Meno, that coats most continuities over time, and does so without doing violence to meaning's knowledge, continuity, and growth. The two senses of creativity influence each other reciprocally. The creativity of response, actual to possible, the second sense, as I talked about in the previous paragraph, grafts the new and the novel onto a lived time, while denying the new and the novel the ability to effectuate dissolution of the significance of already meaningful time. This is a symbiosis rather than parasitism. Accompanying this process, the creativity of superficially spontaneous assertion and expression, possibility to actuality, that first sense that I mentioned, pulls or pushes, sometimes forcefully, sometimes painfully, an already meaningful time toward life. Creativity of response then fixes the new and fixes the novel with an account, again in the sense meant by Plato's Meno, or an accounting that is coherent with the world. And the creativity of spontaneity acts as a gadfly, spurring intratemporal logics of time to comprise more than mere dates in a calendar or ticks of a clock. The tension between spontaneity and response, as well as the relationship between the new and the novel in both senses, constitutes the whole logic, or logos, of any creativity in or of time. Section 2. Creativity, the new and the novel in an already living world. Each new meaning carries with it an ontologico-historical path and continuity. This ontology, as required for each new instance of meaning, conditions the novelty of new meaning by giving it unique historical weight and quality. I mean quality in a distinctly Bergsonian sense. One ought to consider then, prior to parsing the justification for this ontologico-historical logic of meaning, the manner in which persons engage with the world. Now, a complete description of personal engagement with the world through meaning is likely impossible. The likely impossibility of complete description arises because personal engagement with the world is made of and conditioned by a dizzying nexus or even continuum of data, interpretation and reinterpretation, language, epistemic factors, and even physiology, and each of these constituent domains influence the others. Historically minded logicians are therefore obliged to reckon with any and all of these constituencies while still recognizing the unavoidable limits of any one given region of inquiry. In order to trace these temporal logics, one must place oneself, whether actual to possible or possible to actual, in a genealogy. One must resign oneself to immanence and disavow the primacy of the fictional and perhaps impossible view from nowhere. The assertion that persons must reckon with the manner in which their forebears, that's the genealogy, engage with the world has at least two distinct yet complementary lines of justification. Both lines of justification influence interpretation and contribute to the progression of creative logics. This progression, is newness as numeric individuation coupled with novelty as abiding openness. The novel is intimately related to the new, but such a relation is not without tension. The novel is always new, and the novel is not always new, and the new is not always novel. Creativity, though, is always both. Creativity explodes out of the tension between the new and the novel. The first line of justification for the assertion that historical interpreters must reckon with the manner of their forebears' engagement with the world is that there is radical historicity in any interpretive endeavor. If that interpretive endeavor has a logic, as it must, then that logic is an inseparable accompaniment of the engagement. In other words, if one's forebears were doing anything one might understand, such doing was done in accordance with logos, or with a logos at least. Each subsequent generation takes its place and its corresponding perspective in a succession of a logico-historical hike. Each perspective is itself a new mode of receptivity, including vocabularies and meaning schemata, the actual, of other individuals or groups. As Bergson writes, in application of this pervasive tension, quote, "Every sensation is altered by repetition, and that if it does not seem to me to change from day to day, it is because I perceive it through the object which is its cause, through the word which translates it," end quote. In applying language as an instance of logos to object, language becomes object, and the circle is renewed. In all cases, however, the ontogenic accumulation of interpretive perspectives responding to the continuum or nexus of engagement of previous perspectives generates some modicum of novelty, as previously mentioned. Without presuming the view from nowhere, one nonetheless conjoins disparate temporal spans, events, or entities in the course of active and personally grounded possibilization. One hypothesizes, then, disparate temporal spans in order to ground any temporal logic. The possible to actual, which covers the problem of externality, being a rather notable instance of such grounding. Logics of time, then, cannot abide an absolute discontinuity. Radical absolute discontinuity disallows one to dwell and is anathema to both composite possibility and composite actuality. The world may be a mess, but it is still a world and not a mere heap. In addition to the apparently inexorable growth of meaning toward impossible completion, this line of justification speaks to the openness and intimate connection that present, the Zuhanden, meaning has relative to the non-present, past, or the future as about to become past, novelty, the kind of novelty grounded upon possibility. Following Whitehead, novelty is felt presently for the actual entity, but is not meant as novel until assertoric interpretation is given over to a logic in or of dynamic possibilized time. The second line of justification is, perhaps, intuitively contrary to the first. In addition to the radically dynamic historicist and ontogenic interpretation of previous interpretations of meaning, themselves part of the continuum of time, there is a concrete continuity. The concreteness of historical sequence and the stability of context is reckoned with anew by each successive interpreter. As dwellers within the same world, each interpreter is able to trace the genealogy of his or her notions. Each successive generation of interpreters stands on the shoulders, as it were, of those before them, and the history of meaning could be traced by a terminally general interpreter to the first instance of whatever one wishes to name meaning. Question I'll leave for others to interpret. Whereas previous paragraphs described openness to novelty through possibility, continuity between past, present, and future influences, in a strong sense, the ontogenic growth of the whole of meaning, by ensuring that such growth, despite more radical and dynamic reinterpretation, is nonetheless the same actual image of the same actual world within which we all dwell. Of course, it cannot be grasped except by that terminally general, radical, hypothesized interpreter. So, section 3, the Whiteheadian support for creative temporal logics. Whitehead is a process philosopher, and as such is often grouped with other philosophers who speak of becoming as primordial or equiprimordial with being. And Whitehead's notion of becoming is key to understanding his thoughts on time and thereby illuminating the logic of creativity in time. He writes, quote, "There is a prevalent misconception that becoming involves the notion of a unique seriality for its advance into novelty. This is the classic notion of time, which philosophy took over from common sense. Mankind made an unfortunate generalization from its experience of enduring objects. Recent physical science has abandoned this notion. Accordingly, we should now purge cosmology of a point of view which it ought to never have adopted as an ultimate metaphysical principle. The term creative advance is not to be construed in the sense of a uniquely serial advance." End quote. Gary L. Hurstein describes this as a multi-threaded notion of time, one in which, quote, "one family of durations intersects another and lays down the other family's instantaneous space systems of parallels," end quote. He continues, quote, every time's space is densely crisscrossed by such parallel tracks from the indefinite number of alternate time systems which intersects it," end quote. The rejection of a reductive linear time, the uniquely serial advance, and therefore the brute determinism of a progression of mere newness is clear in Whitehead. Nonlinear accounts for the two senses of creativity as potentiality, that is, possibility and actuality reciprocally grounded upon one another. Actuality, in this sense, as Charles Hartshorne writes, is, quote, "a subject about to become object for subsequent subjects," end quote. And though Hartshorne's language of subjectivity is regrettable, one can revise the statement to emphasize the Whiteheadian actual entity. Such a revised statement would read, quote, "Actuality is a concrescence that is prehended by other actual entities, by other concrescences," end quote. And that's my revision. Methodologically, prior to such prehension, however, one must describe potentiality and thereby the process and the tension between actuality and possibility. And one requires a robust notion of potentiality in order to move beyond the narrow concept of time as a linear sequence of nows. Auksher and Hurstein describe time as, quote, "a contingent specification of extension," end quote. But, they note, immediately thereafter, that extension is not space. That's their phrase, quote, "extension is not space." Auksher and Hurstein may well have written that extension is not primarily or primitively space. For, as Whitehead himself writes, quote, "extension, apart from its spatialization and temporalization, is that general scheme of relationships providing the capacity that many objects can be welded into the real unity of one experience," end quote. In Whitehead's Principle of Relativity, written before the landmark Process and Reality, he writes, quote, "the homogeneity of time with space arises from their common share in the more fundamental quality of extension, which is a quality belonging exclusively to events. By extension, I mean that quality in virtue of which one event may be part of another or two events may have a common part," end quote. Clearly, Whitehead's extension is not the extension frequently described in various ways as pernicious to the intensive primordial temporality that grounds all temporal things, and thereby all creativity in time. Whitehead's extension begins and ends with events, temporal things in any reasonable sense of the term. Whitehead's time, then, though extensive, is not the same as extensivized clock time. Space-time, the quasi-Cartesian notion of a four-dimensional volume, is rather abstracted from events, and the event, the temporal thing, is primitive. When one takes the event as primitive, the two senses of creativity with which I began this essay change from speculative logic to concrete, ubiquitous, and temporally dynamic, and sharing relations among themselves. Once the creativity of the actual entity is established, one can then return to the role played by potentiality. For Whitehead, there is general potentiality, quote, provided by the multiplicity of eternal objects, end quote, as well as real potentiality based off the quote-unquote data of the actual world. Auksher and Hurstein name real potentials as those possibilities that have, quote, impressive relevance and systematic order, end quote. The actual entity itself, rather, is what is active and therefore creative. The Whiteheadian scheme offers an already nonlinear account of possibility that reinforces the senses of creativity described in the first two sections of this essay. Continuing, actual entities are part of a grand whole, and the grand whole is a part of each actual entity. As the whole becomes more interesting, more meaningful, with growth toward the impossible completion which I mentioned earlier, its component parts, or regions, also become more interesting. As the whole changes, so too do its parts. This reciprocal change may not be evident if regions of knowledge are viewed in isolation, but as actual components of an interesting whole, with actual and necessary relations to that whole, the component parts will grow in interest and change with the whole. This reciprocal change and evolution is conditioned by the individual actualities insofar as they are dipolar. Actualities are, quote, accompanied by a conceptual reaction partly conformed to it and partly introductory of a relevant novel contrast, end quote. Growth, then, according to novel contrast, is a result of the character of actual entities in the world. This whole part growth is a structure of mutually affecting relations and should be taken as an intelligible, albeit ever-shifting, relation among the various component parts. It is an assemblage of contrasts at a higher level, dependent upon the lower levels. Insofar as the actual entity is both new and novel, the relevant contrasts at the higher levels of generality will also bear both newness and novelty. This part-whole relationship is an aspect of time and subordinately to time, space, that reveals a phenomenon necessary for my argument that logics of creativity are dipolar with the two senses of creativity described in section 1. The part-whole interplay foils linear deterministic and static presentist notions of time. Linearity and presence can only be measured from reference to either a static point in time or to a stable, perhaps fictional, or at least hypothetical whole. When both part and whole are ontogenically self-mutable, though, such concepts of time are eliminated from consideration. Another candidate for integrating Whiteheadian cosmology into the project of describing time as open to creative novelty based on time's and temporal things' own nonlinearity is to take time itself as an albeit ersatz extensive whole. Whitehead describes a single extensive whole as being the result of, quote, a group of actual entities, end quote, that, quote, contributes to the satisfaction of one extensive whole. Of the whole, he writes, quote, it is divisible, but the actual divisions and their sporadic differences of character have sunk into comparative irrelevance beside the one character belonging to the whole and to any of its parts, end quote. Evidence supporting this line of argument is found additionally in Process and Reality, where Whitehead writes, quote, thus the process of integration, which lies at the very heart of concrescence, is the urge imposed on the concrescent unity of that universe by the three categories of subjective unity, of objective identity, and of objective diversity. The oneness of the universe and the oneness of each element in the universe repeat themselves to the crack of doom in the creative advance from creature to creature, each creature including in itself the whole of history and exemplifying the self-identity of things in their mutual diversities, end quote. One can find evidence for this interpretation even earlier in the principle of relativity with applications to physical science. Therein, Whitehead describes time systems. A time system, Whitehead writes, is a sequence of non-intersecting moments including all nature forward and backwards. Moments of different time systems always intersect. That's that overlapping crisscross that Hurstein mentioned earlier in the paper. Although the principle of relativity characterization includes multiple time systems, each system may be taken as a whole. Notably, these systems include within their wholes, quote, all nature forwards and backwards, end quote. Every moment of some such systems, as overlapping, forms a real relation with those other overlapping moments, which then include, quote unquote, all nature. The holism of Whitehead's notion of time, whether as an ersatz whole or as a collection of time systems, is nonlinear and creative by virtue of the inclusion of temporal things, parts, in all articulated temporal phases. Judith A. Jones describes a complementary point of Whiteheadian ontology, writing that when one describes the, quote, scheme of extensive relations, end quote, within the universe, one must recognize that such a scheme is grounded upon, quote, entities seeking intensity of feeling, end quote. One could certainly see such a description applying to the retroactively extensivized, therefore homogenized whole of time. The whole of time seeks in its own satisfaction as an actual entity that feels the myriotopological things that make up the organic whole of the universe. When all such relations, feelings, prehensions, are accounted for in the satisfaction of the organic whole of the universe, real relations among temporal things across all temporal phases are also accounted for. As Auksher and Herstein conclude, quote, as far as we know, all evolutionary, i.e. asymmetrical cumulative processes, taken as units, are developments within a larger whole. The many become one and are increased by the one, end quote. This is the result of the novel becoming of the universe. God, it should be noted, is the name given to the, quote, force for novelty, end quote, in Whitehead's philosophy. God, then, is a force for creativity. This is hardly a radical claim at all. Because Whitehead's ontology is organic and processual rather than merely mereological, topological, or metrical, this kind of cosmological holism avoids the problems one finds in Platonic cosmology and associated formality, and other types of eternalism or inclusive presentism, four-dimensionalism, and the like. Time itself, in a way, contributes to the feelings born of various actual entities and their corresponding inclusive omnitemporal feeling vectors. If time itself is omnidirectional according to these feeling vectors, then creatively is at least dipolar, if not multipolar. And any successful logic of creativity must capture and express the dynamic tension between the actual possible orientation and the possible actual orientation. When one recognizes that both actuality and possibility are dynamic and contribute to dynamic feeling a la Whitehead, then creativity reveals itself to be omnitemporal. Creativity, as both new and novel, as well as corresponding logics of creativity, bring in an intentional sense, and push out, in an extensional sense, time with and within each creative process. Thank you.
Well, it seems for a paper on temporality that one ought to begin to facilitate the discussion by asking a when question. and so I was kind of struck by this idea. It's earlier on in the paper where you talk about the felt presence of novelty. Mm-hmm. And it's and my question is when is novelty recognized as such? Mm-hmm. So that's the when question, and it strikes me that novelty often is only seen in retrospect. And so that notion of a felt present, or novelty is felt presently, struck me as a bit odd.
And I agree with you. I would say that the phrase retrospectively is the best we have. I would assert that it's retrospectively in a sequential retrospection. I agree with you on that it becomes known or meant as novel after the fact. But I think it is also possible, at least in the sense of a Whiteheadian actual entity, if not a personal experience, that novelty and the weight of novelty can be felt as the future about to become past. So I agree with your description, and I agree with the premise of your question. And the only quibble that I have is I think that we're limited by a very linearized language of retrospection, prospection, and so forth, whereas the possibility of something being novel is felt both as a past possibility or a past actuality and a future possibility about to become actual.
Well, it's like a feeling of life in Kant or Husserl, right? Which definitely is anticipatory of the future. But remember, for Whitehead, felt doesn't mean physically felt. It means prehended, right? And so we take account, as I say, we take account of things with that. You don't, in order to prehend something, you don't have to be conscious of it at all. It means it has been taken account of by your becoming.
It can be given over to account in
and
what I would call logos.
And I would say that the new, in the way you use the word, is the one that actually poses the problem here, not the novel. The new would probably have to be over with to be recognized as new. But the novel, because the new is recognized, it's linear, right? and so it's like you have to be past it and say, oh, that was new. And so this is so our linear experience of the new is something that probably has to be over. But for novelty, not so.
I agree, and I think
it's non-linear.
Perhaps I'd like to rephrase my earlier response and say that it's not just retrospectively or future as possible retrospection, but if I could abuse the language here and just say spectively. Retrospectively or prospectively.
Just say spectively.
Spectively.
The novel is identified spectively.
When the novel is given over to meaning, and then through being given over to meaning becomes object.
Yeah, it has meaning before it's known to have it.
Exactly. But of course, we don't know it to have meaning until we place it in a logos.
Exactly. And the logos is more than just language, but it includes language.
Right. It's subordinate to language.
Mm-hmm. Other questions?
Well,
Pass.
since nobody else is saying anything, I think I missed this because I was a few minutes late, so I apologize for that. But could you repeat for me the distinction that you're making between the new and the novel?
Yeah, that was absolutely the first thing.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. But just so that I'm on the same page as you.
Sure.
The new is within temporality. It's successive.
The new is successive, temporal,
Succession.
sequentially.
Sequentially.
It's extensivized. It's
Okay.
always already extensivized, and the novel is ontologically qualitative first and foremost, and then it becomes extensivized or placed in sequence or placed and subsumed in logos and language respectively.
Well, the point is that you don't want to make it turn into some ontologically linear thing, which you mean by the novel. Mm-hmm. The novel can be described in linear fashion, but it isn't limited by any description.
It's not limited by any description, but our descriptions are limited by whatever means we're using. Yeah, I agree. Like Whitehead and Bergson, I'm really struggling with the imposition of language here on ontology.
What's the I don't know if this is the right way to say it, but what's the character of the feeling tone when an actual entity prehends novelty? If those are the right sequence of words there, is this something? Because just psychologically speaking, the new and the novel are something that we approach only with difficulty, oftentimes, right? Like that. I am afraid of something, but because by introducing it into my actual world, it's a dramatic change, and this irreversible change, right? And so oftentimes even just psychologically people, I know this is a completely different level of conversation, but you know what I mean, like we're afraid of the novel, we approach it only very carefully. So what is the feeling tone then of prehending the novel? Is this something that we move towards? Is this something that we only approach very carefully? Can we even, maybe it's just not at the level of that kind of an awareness?
I think that's too much of an egoistic.
Yeah, too psychological.
Too psychological on it. The one thing that I would also kind of disputing the premise of the question is the novelty of the newness. Much of what we experience is new and is really, really mundane.
Yeah.
I mean, each heartbeat and breath we take and metabolism and all of that to be physiological, if not psychological, is new.
Right.
But if it's novel, each new heartbeat that I'm experiencing is so thinly novel as to be indistinct. It's effectively unnovel. Until, of course, retrospectively, until it stops. I mean, perhaps this is my roundabout way of getting to your question, which is the new becomes the novel in, for instance, the psychological and physiological experience of skipping a heartbeat when you don't know that you're going to, or a hiccup.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is like in the realm of what I'm asking, because it feels like then if we're making a distinction between the new and the novel, the feeling tone, to use a Deweyan word, or the prehension, to use a Whiteheadian, of those should have a different character. And so maybe that's getting on, like, what makes something mundane as opposed to novel, whether it's new or not, you know, right? Like, and so, because this is going back, I think, to Dave's question about, like, when you experience the novelty of this thing, if it's felt in the moment in some way, shape, or form, can we describe the quality of that feeling or not?
Sure, I think we can retrospectively. This I think is another part that you might have missed. It's the relationship of novelty to possibility, where in a hiccup, the first hiccup in a sequence, if you will, the third and fifth and the 17th one is thoroughly mundane and often very painful, but the first heartbeat that you skip, not only is it new, like, oh, that's a new sensation, but it brings you face to face with possibility.
So
in
the presence of the possibility.
The presence of the possibility.
The quality of the feeling.
I use the Heideggerian term to abide and dwell in a relationship to possibility. And so I think that's the feeling, at least at a psychological level, that allows us to retrospectively or prospectively recognize novelty in at least that level of generality as experience. What orientation do we take between the actual and possible?
I want to kind of piggyback off of this exchange, which is really good. I think Whitehead, and people won't be surprised that I'm saying this, has a better term for this. It's not in any of his indexes, but I've tried to compile the index, and he uses it over 100 times, so I think that it's actually a technical term. And his term is entertainment, and not in this kind of aestheticized sense, but in a metaphysical sense. And I think that you can see an analogy with Bergson's qualitative calculus in terms of what you're trying to get at in distinguishing between the novel and the new and getting at those the subtleties of those qualities. So a kind of processual entertainment, to me, goes along with his notion of abiding when he talks about abide with me in part 5.
Right.
If you think of the tame and entertain as you could maintain or you could entertain. That's the sense of the word, and remember, and this is to Jared too, that Bergson, your favorite philosopher, you just love Bergson.
Why are you saying?
Because you always give me a hard time about Bergson.
I don't understand.
What Bergson said, and Matt quoted it just before you got here, is that there is no such thing as a complete repetition. That there's some variation in every new moment, and so not only is the novel ubiquitous and all-pervading might be a better word. The novel is all-pervading, but the novel as a movement from possible to actual, and that's the the newness is the movement from actual to possible, and so the movement from possible to actual means that you're surrounded by the possibility all the time. You feel it in the sense of prehend it continually, but because you feel it continually in the sense of prehending it, it can surprise you when expectation is not immediately
and that's why I'm seeing it as you're breaking the repetition, or at least it's like breaking the former exercises. So this abiding with it's not an entertainment of habitus, It can be associated with habit, but it's actually breaking what the habits are or what the repetitions are.
Well, and as I think, Myron, as you probably know, because I noticed you following along, I do mention in one of the footnotes the similarity, almost eerily so, that in the way Whitehead and Heidegger both use the term, at least as translated, as abide. And so I would say if I'm going to pick a Whiteheadian term, I prefer abide to entertain, simply because if I want to be open, or perhaps even gluttonous about my sense of creativity, I think there's a sense of stillness and possibility in stillness in at least our understanding of the term abide that's captured in both the Whiteheadian and the Heideggerian sense. And I'm not quite sure if entertainment captures that, so that's why I prefer that to be the Whiteheadian term that I use.
But abiding is going to be the broader category. Entertaining has to do with the way that you can stuff one event into another event, yet it's all still one experience, and you can't maintain it for very long. But entertaining means stuffing the next event into holding on to the previous one, and so one actual occasion can have many events in it. And so it's like just stuffing the future into the past until you can't maintain it anymore. But that's what entertaining is.
Sure.
And also
Holding on,
and also
but you still can't think it until it's over.
And
So,
and the virtue of entertainment in that sense is it allows a subspecies, so to speak, of this abiding and of this creativity to capture the composition of the feeling, of the prehension. So it's not just, whereas there can be creativity where there's one vector, and there's abiding with one vector. It's not the only way, and I like the fact that, as you say, the entertainment allows for that increased dynamic composition. I think that that's appropriate.
an empirical example of this would be that that British composer and musician who had the head injury and couldn't form new memories. And I don't know if anybody's ever watched the videos of this guy, but anyway, so every 30 seconds or so he wakes up in a new world. But they discovered that if they set him in front of an orchestra, he can direct an entire. He's entertaining. He's stuffing events, but then he goes into convulsions. His body goes in, so he gets done conducting. It's just so deeply in his body, but you can't call it habitus, because if it were merely habitus, he wouldn't go into those convulsions at the end. But what has happened is that however long the piece is, he has stuffed all of the events and all of the acts that went into hearing it, and creatively so, that went into hearing what he was conducting. But that's too much. Our bodies can't handle like 20 minutes. They discovered he could go for 20 minutes, whereas normally his memory limit was 30 seconds. But it left him in convulsions, in seizures.
And I think that does return us nicely to Jared's question as far as how do we at a conscious or even psychological, egoistic level experience this, and it's again, anytime there's a relationship taken up from the actual to the possible. And when you think about all the possibility, and if we just take a moment to do it right now, it's cacophonous, it's overwhelming.
Just real quick, I wanted to add that I know you focused on the metaphysics of time, but if we look at this aesthetically, which is what I was kind of thinking throughout your paper, it seems like today people want to get at the entertainment of the unrepeatable event, or the novel event. And they get immense value out of this, or at least they get a lot of status out of this. We put a lot of high priority or value into it.
And over and over and over and over again.
Well, if you go, let's say if you go to a Vermeer showing, that's only a one-time thing, and they're all in this one location for 2 weeks, and people make pilgrimages from all over the world to see it because they don't know if they're ever going to see it again. That kind of novelty, I think, in the aesthetic sense, is what many people are seeking in this kind of intense creativity that's not just the new, but it actually is. It has a novelty that's rested in the value of possibility coming out of it.
Certainly, I certainly agree, and I think that it's grounded upon that sense of temporalized creativity. I completely agree with you on that.
I had a question about this. So I really liked your approach that you're starting with these kind of broader patterns, and you're talking about the tension between actuality and possibility over time, which is generative kind of relationship. And it seems to me, though, that we can talk about novelty on that level, but when we start getting into discussions of creativity, that seems to involve shifts in perspective as well. That it seems like what we usually call a creative act, and we don't need to have this on the egoistic level, or we could talk about it that way, but I felt that's something was missing, and I think I put my finger on it, which is this constant shift in framework on top of all of that. That this is kind of what someone like, people who talk about rhetorical tropes, that this is what they're interested in, is how irony and synecdoche and metonymy and metaphor kind of always have this tensive relationship in acts of creation. And so, with that said, where would you kind of locate those kinds of shifts in perspectives in this general theory, which I understand you're kind of giving this very general idea, but...
I would locate it at the unstable equilibrium of the dipolarity in creativity between the new and the novel, between the sense of moving from the actual to possible and the possible to actual. Like any unstable equilibrium, there's actually any number of forces at play, and one shift in perspective, as you describe it, I think that's appropriate to talk about it, pushes it or pulls it around or within that act. And so the prehensions, to use the Whiteheadian term, relate to one another through the actual entity based on how the unstable equilibrium explodes or falls apart, however you wish to view the end of an unstable equilibrium. So I think that's what I mean when I said at the beginning of the paper, it explodes out. Now, whether it explodes out into something that is both novel and purely sequentially new, like a great meal that you're never going to be able to eat again as an aesthetic experience, or something that is novel almost by virtue of its repetition, that we seek novelty in these art installations where they play the same song for 2 hours, and that's the novelty of it, that it builds up because of that. That's the explosion out of the new and the novel that I think is where it's located.
Right, because even in those experiences, you're seeing something by and through the perspective of something else.
Exactly. And that's why I wanted to emphasize that I really find the idea of this view from nowhere, or identifying it as a single point, is untenable. So it's
Well, he
aware.
calls it a vacuous actuality, doesn't
Yeah,
he?
he calls it back.
It's aware, but it's going to be a different where for almost every creative event.
I have
Yeah.
a picture of myself 6 or 7 bites into one of those meals you just described, and stopping and thinking, oh wow, I didn't realize. What I should have been saying is, this is an unstable equilibrium here.
And the moment you stop to realize it, the moment you give it over to meaning, it loses some of its novelty.
Absolutely. Yes.
But the respect in which it seems to be created is where it suddenly opens up new possibilities. Oh, I can use tamarind for this.
Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah.
And there's sort of a general comment. You're talking about the interplay between actuality and possibility, and I often think of creativity in the shiftings of diminished ranges of possibilities, and suddenly an event, and now the whole world opens up. There's lots new possibilities.
That's the explosive sense.
Yeah, and that's what I was catching. But that's more kind of comparing possibilities. There's the range of possibilities. More so
Heidegger's
talking
horizon.
so much. Yeah.
Well, possibilities are not altered by the events.
And I don't know
They
that
were
we're
there
ever,
before and they're there later.
and I don't know that at least within a creative context we're ever without possibility. It might be broader or narrower, but we're never without possibility. Possibility is always real.
I was just thinking of creativity. Suddenly,
Yeah.
if you want that felt sense,
Mhm.
suddenly I can do so much more.
Right.
I think that's right.
Well,
It's empowering.
we should draw this one to an end and take 10 minutes.
All right. Thanks for